Right, so welcome to the webinar with Associate Professor Liezel, who is joining us from Stellenbosch University today. And she's going to be talking about doctoral education in South Africa more broadly, and then we're going to move on to talk about doctoral supervision specifically. Liezel is Director of the Centre for Higher and Adult Education at Stellenbosch in the Faculty of Education. And she is actively researching on doctoral education. Just two or three things that might be of interest before we start. Liezel asked me to share with you the International Postgraduate Supervision Conference that she co-chairs that happens in Stellenbosch every other year, so I'm sure you can Google more information about that. And also the IDEN network, which she co-chairs along with Professor Gina Whisker from Brighton University, and that's the International Doctoral Education Network. I have one note, which is an upcoming UK Council for Graduate Education event, which will take place on November the 29th in central London at the Association of Commonwealth Universities in London. And that's on North-South global collaborations in doctoral education, which has quite a lot of resonances with the conversation that we're about to have. So welcome, Liezel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for taking the time to come and speak with us and to participate in this webinar.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, the first sort of area I think that it would be useful to discuss is doctoral education in South Africa. Obviously it's a different context to what we have here in the UK, and it would be useful just to have some sense of some of the key issues and challenges and the policy environment, I guess, for doctorates. So I guess thinking about producing PhD graduates in South Africa, the numbers of PhDs are climbing, but they remain at quite a low level. Can you talk a little bit about the aspirations of the South African government to raise numbers of PhDs?
So in South Africa, you are quite right. I don't particularly like the term producing doctorates, but for the lack of a better term in the policy environment, if we use that for the moment, the 10-year innovation plan of the National Department of Science and Technology in South Africa in 2008 envisioned an increase of about a factor of about 5 times. And public funds have been used to that effect to stimulate growth within doctoral education at public higher education institutions. Now, we have 26 public universities in the country. There are, of course, a number of private universities as well, but up to date, some of them, but not a lot of them, do doctoral education. So the bulk of doctoral education gets done within those 26 public universities. Not all of them have doctoral programs within every discipline, and there's a lot of diversity within the higher education sector. So I would say that there is 4 or 5 research-intensive universities focus more on postgraduate education and produce the highest number of doctorates, more so. But it's not to say that the others don't at all. But if you look at the numbers, that would be the case. Now, there have been significant increases. So, for instance, in 2000, 972 doctorates graduated. In 2017, there were more than 3,000. So we can see that there's a definite increase, but it's still way below the kind of targets that is envisioned. And again, there's not this direct correlation, of course, between producing high-level academic qualifications and economic growth. But we do know that within the country we do need more of that kind of high-level skills and training. So it seems as if the sort of target that we set out in the National Development Plan of 5,000 doctorates by 2030 is achievable, but it's not to say that it's without barriers or that that target is unproblematic for us. So those are sort of the figures that we are looking at.
Sure, and I think that's a narrative that we're hearing from many countries that are in a similar position to South Africa. And in fact, the number 5,000, the Indonesian government has a 5,000 doctoral program, which is looking to drive up the number of doctorates.
So they also got the memo.
Yeah, possibly. And I'm curious, is the idea that these will be doctorates, that kind of neoliberal ideal that they will come in and they will drive innovation in industry and business, or is it around moving kind of practicing academics who are teaching in the universities onto the next level to start producing research?
I think it's both. It's not the one or the other. So in South Africa, we do have a paucity of doctorated academics. So it's still way below target. So the most research intensive universities still have below 70% of the academic staff have doctorates, between 60 and 70%. Whereas many of the universities of technology, that would be the kind of polytechnics, have way less than that. And the figures are publicly available. So if you want to have more of a look at that. So there is a kind of a strong drive to regenerate the academic workforce and also to upskill them. We also have an aging cohort of the professorate, and because of that, we need way more early career researchers coming into the system, and of course having them have doctorates. So that's part of the reason. But there's also a strong push from government on the other side, not just to regenerate the academic workforce, but also to get more doctorates into the wider economy. We're not particularly good with that at the moment, I'm afraid. Many companies aren't employing doctorates in their R&D areas.
Is it because they don't see the value, or
No,
they're not there to hire?
I think a bit of both, but I think definitely they don't see the value. And as universities, I think we haven't done enough to have those kind of conversations with industry to make sure that they understand why a doctorate is different to a master's, and why it's not just an overqualified, expensive person you're going to employ, but that they have very specific different skills to somebody who's just got a bachelor's or a master's, and to make sure that South Africa as a whole can benefit from that, and we haven't been really good at that, I'm afraid.
Sure. And I think in the UK we've had a discourse over maybe the last 5 to 10 years, which is around demonstrating the added value of a PhD to business and industry. And in some sectors there's a clear acknowledgement, but in many sectors it just isn't there. And even where it is, there are issues with absorption in terms of whether business and industry can make good use of the research and innovation that's incoming with the PhD graduate.
Of course, it differs between disciplines. There would be more of that within the STEM areas, but South Africa has got quite a well-established NGO sector, for instance, where many of the social science doctorates might, have a deciding influence. So there's a wide variety of outside of university areas where doctorates, I think, can make more of a difference, which we're not currently doing. Something that might be interesting is also that it's only very recently that we have policy and regulations in place that allow for us to offer professional doctorates. So that's not common in South Africa at all, and I believe that professional doctorates could, in the long term, provide an avenue. At the moment, doctorates are research focused mostly in South Africa, so that's also a difference in that you need to factor into this kind of debate.
So the first wave of professional doctorates in South Africa, is that NGD or is it DBA, or?
They don't exist yet.
Okay.
It takes quite a lot, there may be 1 or 2 programs, but they're not common at all. And also it takes quite some time to register a new program and jumping through all the hoops. Even if you just recurriculate a program, it takes a lot of time. So I think they will come. But also you need to take into account, if you are offering professional doctorates, you need staff who are well versed in what they are and how they're different from the research focused PhD programs. And examiners. And within our national system we haven't developed that yet. So it will take a long time for it to really take off, I think.
You mentioned offline that there's currently a review taking place in South Africa looking at regulations for doctorates. Do you think professional doctorates will be sort of part of that review?
Well, the review is currently underway. It's a national review of doctoral programs. So it's a high-level review. It's not discipline-specific or looking at individual theses and so forth. It's more institutionally looking at what kind of doctorates you offer, what capacity do you have to do so, what are the kind of policies and regulations you have in place in order to make sure that you offer high-quality programs. I think part of that might be, it would be interesting to see what the recommendations are that come forth from that review, and that might be one of them, but I'm not sure whether it will be. So it will be interesting to see how that develops, but it's underway at the moment.
Okay, that's interesting. So thinking about the Australian context, the 2016 ACOLA report was talking about this curiosity about professional doctorates and a need to do more in terms of business and industry engagement at a doctoral level. And I'm wondering whether that is going to, we try here, but there are many difficulties. We're not there yet. We can see in policy it's definitely an imperative coming through in some of the Australian policy documentation. I wonder whether South Africa will sort of join that trajectory.
Well, whether they want to and why they would want to would be an interesting debate. I was actually at the launch of the ACOLA report, one of the launches at the QPR conference, and what's interesting about the ACOLA report, we wrote an opinion piece on it afterwards from a sort of south-south perspective, and we were quite critical about the influence that industry can have on determining research questions, what we should be researching and how we should be researching it, because the doctorate, how does that then influence the kind of original contribution and forward thinking of the doctorate, which might be different in a professional doctorate. And I think the ACOLA report definitely, that is where that kind of discourse belongs within the professional doctorate. But you also need to see where the origins of that discourse comes from, and it comes from a kind of North American perspective, which of course has a very different system to the research-focused kind of Oxbridge model that we follow in both our countries as well as in Australia predominantly. So including those kinds of added fixtures into a research-focused program, one needs to be very careful. It's not to say you shouldn't do it, but you need to be very careful how you do it, because you can just load on top and on top and on top. And in the end, like Margaret Kiley says, it's a PhD, not a Nobel Prize. So I think in future there will be opportunities for growth around professional doctorates in South Africa, and I think rightly so, but we need to develop the capacity in terms of supervision, examination, curriculation, all of those kind of things that currently does not adequately exist.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it made me think while you were talking actually about the broader kind of research policy in the UK context and what we're seeing in terms of research funding, just kind of shifting towards the impact agenda, challenge-based research questions. The UK government has made a commitment to 2.4% of GDP is going to be invested in research, moving to 3% by 2030, and the expectation is that it's going to be business and industry that top up government investment in research and innovation. Well, if business and industry are providing the funding, then they start to be guiding the questions, and we see how things might move going forwards. And if that is going to be happening across the research piece, then obviously doctoral education is a fundamental part of that. So I do wonder whether the line between a standard traditional, you can problematize that, however you want to frame it, but a straightforward PhD and a professional doctorate, I see that line is going to be blurring. And
absolutely, and we've seen that in Australia happening, absolute blurring between those lines. I think in the US context it's been more defined based on the kind of coursework that these doctorates do, because they've got coursework in both. So there it's been more distinct, I think, than in an Australian context. And having business and industry involved is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a slippery slope when they start making demands on the kind of questions we're allowed to ask. And I don't think we should have those kinds of limitations put on doctorates that are supposed to be forward-thinking.
Sure. Okay, I just want to change tack just slightly, because some of the next questions I wanted to ask were really around attrition rates, completion rates, and it sort of is related to how the doctorate is changing, because of course the more we ask of our doctoral candidates, the more concerned we get about time to completion and whether they'll drop out. And you mentioned that maybe many of the people who are going to be doing PhDs in the South African context, they might be practicing academics already, and of course they have a day job. We see this in the UK context also when we're working in partnership with transnational education partners, for example, from developing countries, where there's an imperative that those staff they have very heavy teaching loads already and a day job, and they are not going to get a 4-year sabbatical to complete their PhD, and they have to kind of hold those two things in tension and get the PhD alongside everything else. Could you give us a little bit of an insight into attrition rates and completion rates in the South African context?
So in terms of attrition and completion, I think attrition is too high. We see that between 6 and 8 years of doctoral study, we still have about a 50% attrition rate, which is, to my mind, too high, of course. It also says about who we're letting into the doctorate, and that sounds rather elitist when you say it, but the point is, are the people who enter the doctorate well prepared for what they'll be facing within the doctorate? So we've seen at some universities, they have what they call pre-doc programs that are really wonderful mechanisms to help people, because you also need to keep in mind the context where we've had huge educational disparities, and this is part of a bigger process of redress and of capacitating people that might not have had the same educational opportunities from school level through university once they get to the doctorate, besides being part-time students. And more than 60% of South African doctoral students are part-time students, even though the mechanisms in order to trace that isn't as nuanced as we want them to be and as accurate as we want them to be at an institutional level. In terms of the completion rates, I don't think we're doing too badly, because if you look at the average time to completion across the world, it's 6-point-something years, and South Africa falls within those margins. So even though we have a long way to go and many things we need to improve, not everything is sort of in shambles and falling out of place. There's some really good work to be done, and many of our doctoral students do go and work abroad. We also, I think what is important to mention is, even though that we see and we acknowledge that we still haven't reached parity in terms of gender and racial representation in doctoral programs, and particularly in STEM areas across the board, for our own citizens, we are seeing an influx of doctoral students from other African countries who may have otherwise have gone to the US or to the UK or to France for the Francophone part of Africa. We are seeing more and more of those students coming to South Africa as a preferred site of doctoral education. And I don't necessarily see that as a negative, because the more we are able to contribute to the education of the continent as a whole, as diverse as it may be, the more we can contribute to the stability of the continent as a whole. And I think that is an important role for us to play as a country. I think it's extremely important, given also the current events in South Africa that you might have picked up on the news, that we continue to play this kind of capacitating and development role, and that we speak to these events in a way, in a constructive way, that we are able to contribute to society as a whole, and not just within our country and within our borders, but across the continent.
And I guess it gets sort of southern theory and north-south relationships and south-south relationships get a little bit, they require further nuancing actually. Absolutely. When it comes to the top research universities in South Africa, because of course arguably they're much more closer to some of the big research intensives in Europe and in America and elsewhere. But maybe there's still an added value to being able to have those closer south-south networks and
absolutely
educating PhDs for the continent of Africa within the African continent.
And also by doing that, also capacitating their home universities to be able to offer PhDs, not just remaining the site of. That's just a new way of colonizing. So I'm part of an initiative run by our Centre for Evaluation in Research and Evaluation in Science and Technology, or CREST, at Stellenbosch University, and as a consortium, we have developed an online supervisor training short course, particularly aimed at capacitating supervisors on the continent. And it seems to be quite successful, and I value being involved in those kinds of initiatives, because it's not just about training the next student and getting them through, but it's about the value that they can add and the kind of paying forward that they can do. And there's obviously, I don't know in the UK, but there is this kind of idea that if you have a doctorate that you can automatically supervise, and I find that very problematic.
Sure, I think this is something that we're very cognizant of in terms of our international PhD candidate community, because often they will come here and they'll do a PhD. A lot of the discourse in terms of research and development, so doctoral training, generic skills, makes an assumption that these PhD candidates are, 21 years old and from the UK or the European Union. But actually for international candidates, they might well be mid-career. They will come do their PhD and then they will go straight back to their home institution as a head of school, let's say, and also they'll have to pick up a half a dozen supervisees. So that's a very, very different trajectory, and their needs, therefore, I think are really quite distinct. And maybe we don't spend enough time thinking about that and thinking how we can best support them for this mammoth task that they have to undertake when they go back. There's often been a lot of investment in sending them to the UK to do a PhD, and a huge obligation to pay back to see a return on that investment.
And also, but what is also problematic within that kind of scenario, they come to the UK or to the US or to South Africa even, and they work in some of the best research environments in the world. And then they go back where their home university might not have the same resources, physical infrastructural resources, that they were used to having, and they might not be able to continue their research trajectory along the same line just because of a lack of those infrastructural resources, and they might have a lack of a research community, which they were used to having in the other environment. So those things kind of complicate. And what we have also seen in some cases, not all, but there's a kind of old guard that have been doing things in a particular way, and we might be propagating around supervision and other ways, alternative ways of approaching supervision, which might challenge the established ways that they might be used to in their countries of origin and home institutional environments.
Thank you. You've touched on the complexities of doctoral supervision, and I wonder whether it might be good to move there next, really. I think you have very specific experiences of supervising in a South African context. You've written and published on those experiences with your former PhD candidate, now graduate. Could you talk a little bit about your experiences and the complexities of supervisory relationships in a complex society?
Well, I think any supervisory context is complex, and everyone is unique. So some are just more unique than others, I suppose. So in the South African context, we have a kind of intertextual layering of complexities that play out in unique ways, partly as a result of our socio-political historical past. So you have layers of complexity around race, around ethnicity. These two things aren't necessarily the same. You have complexities around gender. South Africa's also been in the news for the past week or so for those kinds of reasons. You have complexities around age and the way in which people relate to each other based on age. So in the chapter that you've referred to, we wrote a dual narrative based on a particular supervisory experience, and we try to really not to just do sort of navel gazing on our own experience, but sort of link it to the scholarship in the field to make sense and kind of give a logic to what we experience, so that if others experience similar, although not exactly the same kind of complexities, how can we collectively think about that in order to navigate it and negotiate those complexities in a constructive way. And the particular, my co-author on the chapter, or the first author on the chapter, Zondi Mkdela, was so different to me in many ways, given the South African context. And yet, I learned so much from him, and I hope he has learned something from me. So I do believe that we were able to somehow negotiate those complexities in a way where we have built trust and respect, mutual trust and respect within our professional relationship. Mm-hmm. Because it does remain a professional relationship at heart.
Sure. I think that sense of reciprocity in learning in the supervisory relationship came out very strongly in the book chapter. And it strikes me that it may be happening and it may be common in supervisory relationships, and I'd like to think it is, but it's not often made explicit in that way, and I think that's quite valuable.
I think quite often we write reflectively about our experiences in education, at least, but it's often a kind of one-sided reflection, and so we wanted to move beyond that. We wanted to capture that kind of reciprocity and also the kind of mutuality of experience that would add richness of understanding. If only I wrote about it or only Zondi wrote about it, it would just give sort of one side of the coin. Mm-hmm. And in a supervisory relationship, it's never just the one or the other. Mm-hmm. So I think for us that was really important to at least try and capture some of that mutuality that had developed over time, which wasn't always plain sailing or unproblematic either.
Mm-hmm. Do you think time actually played an important part in allowing you the space to take that reflexive approach? Is it something you could have written at the beginning of that supervisory relationship?
No, not at all. We wouldn't have been able to do that. Definitely not. I think it is the only reason why we were able to do it is because Zondi had, by the time we wrote this chapter, he had graduated. Mm. So we could look back, we could reflect back. So it wasn't reflection in action, it was reflection on action. But given the complexity of the situation, I think it would have made it more complex to do it while we were busy in that process. It was more useful, and it gave us both a kind of sense of closure to be able to look back and see how far we've come.
And as someone who has gone on to supervise other candidates and is currently supervising, was it in some senses reflection for action also? Did you use the learning from that and take that forward in other...
And what is wonderful about, I mean, I've supervised a number of students, and Zondi's is a particular experience, but there are other students, for each and every student that I supervise, I learn from them, and I take that experience forward, and they all teach me something. This was just an opportunity at the right time, and Zondi was willing to kind of explore this particular facet of supervision with me. He's gone on to supervise students as well. So it's been a kind of wonderfully fruitful relationship. We've collaborated since on projects around intercultural supervision, for instance, where we've co-facilitated workshops on this, which has been a wonderfully enriching experience for I think both of us.
And I think that notions around intercultural supervision are becoming more of greater interest in the UK context, because we can see that the numbers of international candidates that we're going to have are only going to rise, and maybe we haven't necessarily been as sensitive to the differences that are required from the supervisory relationship, or just that sense, not necessarily particularly with an international candidate, but as you said, that sense of everyone is unique, and there are lots of individuals out there, and a tailored approach that tries to meet the needs of
But you know, an interesting point in terms of what you're saying, yes, very much so, in terms of internationalizing universities, and that seems to be a dominant kind of narrative within the higher education sector currently across the world. But even your local students aren't homogenous. You just have to walk in London or in the streets of Coventry to see that just because they grow up in Britain or have a British passport doesn't mean that they look the same, or that they're culturally or ethnically the same, or that they have the same gender orientation. So even your domestic students, we are just probably in South Africa hyper aware of that, because I mean we have 11 official languages, so we are on high alert, basically always sort of thinking about how we negotiate these complexities, given that our domestic students are so diverse and we have increasing numbers of international students. But in the UK and across Europe, the whole demography of society has changed significantly over the past 2 decades and more. So I think it's basically thinking about each and every student that you supervise.
I agree, and I think, you know, there's a lot being written on massification of higher education, and it does go all the way through up to PhD level, and we are seeing barriers being broken down, and our UK research councils have a focus now like never before on equality, diversity and inclusion for the research community, which is obviously from PhD all the way through to professor, and we're seeing data being collected and analysed that looks at the 9 protected characteristics and gives us a clearer picture than we've ever had in terms of who is making up our doctoral population, our researcher population, but specifically in this context, our doctoral population. And that idea of, you know, universities having to go the extra mile to open up doctoral education to different communities, and then an obligation to provide doctoral supervision or doctoral training that meets the needs of a more diverse community.
And particularly for first generation students coming into doctoral education, I think that is immensely important to have that kind of understanding and sensitivity.
Sure. Okay, I just want to move on to talk a little bit about the UKCGE's Good Supervisory Practice Framework, and maybe to get some of your thoughts on that. So, as you know, UK Council for Graduate Education is about to launch the framework for good supervisory practice, and one of the principles behind this framework is that doctoral pedagogy benefits from being reflective, and from supervisors reflecting on their own practice. What do you think about that principle, particularly, I guess, in the context of your paper and the reflection that you did with Zondi?
Well, I also have to say, I mean, I've studied the framework, and I think it is an immensely useful document, partly because it is so succinct. I think it's user-friendly, and it's generic enough that it cuts across disciplines, and it cuts across, it's basically applicable to every kind of doctoral education and pedagogical interaction. So I think it's a very useful point of departure to have, and it's definitely something that I will be taking back home and sharing with others. Having said that, I think it is extremely important for supervisors to be reflective about their practice, but not in a way. Often we emphasize reflection as this sort of fashionable word, yet we don't really think about what constitutes reflection. And reflection can be not necessarily a good thing. If reflection is framed as something I have to do to kind of tick a box, to say either for promotion or for my performance evaluation or for some other award that I just have to reflect to get this done, it doesn't really make sense to do it. That's not really the purpose of reflection. Reflection, if it's truly reflection in order to think critically about my own practice and the way in which I do things, and in order to improve on what I do and how I do it, then it makes sense. But if it's just for the sake of, I don't really see the benefit of it.
No, I think you're right. I suspect that we all actually reflect on everything that we do as supervisory practice, but many other things also, and it's part of being a professional, right? But for me, what the framework offers is just a sense of the shape of good practice, of the shape of the many things that we could all be doing and should be engaging in. And then it's therefore a bit of a backdrop. So when you're having those kind of 3 o'clock in the morning moments where you're just, sort of replaying your day to yourself, as we all do, it gives you just a few additional ideas and a bit more context.
And I think the framework is also useful for an individual supervisor to think about, what am I doing? What are the things I'm not doing? What are the things that I'm doing probably really well already, but what are the things that I might want to improve upon? And also, I might be doing this really well. So I have a good relationship with my students. I get them through on time, I give them feedback on time, I am an expert in my field, but maybe I'm not thinking about where they go after this. And should I maybe include a conversation here and there about that? So it kind of helps you to highlight also the things that you might not have thought about doing. So a framework in that sense, but once a framework becomes prescriptive, that might be problematic. Yeah. But once it is used as a tool for development, I think it can be extremely useful.
Yeah, I think speaking with our early career researchers, often the thing that makes them anxious is that they have very limited experience of supervision outside of their own supervisory for their own doctorate, and so something that's kind of anonymised and generalised, but gives that sense of where the norms and the expectations are, can be quite helpful, actually, not necessarily in critical reflection, but actually also in easing some of those anxieties about, am I doing the right thing? You know, usually what we get when we work with early career researchers is a very polarised response to their own experiences of being a PhD candidate. I either hated my supervisor, and so when I became a supervisor, I did exactly the opposite of everything that individual ever said to me and did to me, or they say my supervisor was absolutely brilliant, and I just try and do what they did. So what I quite like is that sort of taking a little bit of the pressure and the kind of the personal and the individual out of that thinking, and just saying, okay, so as a sort of an accumulation of many different supervisory experiences, these are the sorts of things that we can be thinking about and engaging in when we think about good supervisory practice.
And in addition to that, I think where the framework can be really useful in terms of developmental work around working with doctoral students, candidates, and as well as with early career researchers, it could be a kind of dialogical tool. To say, well, you know, how do you think about this? How do you want to approach this? And I think that kind of dialogue can be really useful as a kind of reflective tool, and the framework allows you to do that.
Sure, thank you. So just finally, I wondered whether you had one piece of advice for new doctoral supervisors out there who'll be taking on their first doctoral candidate for the first time.
This is a really difficult one because the contexts are so different and people are so different, and I would hate to sound prescriptive. But if I think back about my own practice and working developmentally with a lot of supervisors over the years, I think one is eager to get out the blocks. But a word of caution might be not to take on too many students right from the start. I think you need to be careful especially who you pick as your first candidate that you're supervising, so that you have the necessary expertise in the field to feel comfortable, at least in your field of expertise, to supervise that candidate. It's helpful if you can build a good rapport with the candidate from the start. And something for a really novice supervisor, I'm a great believer in co-supervision. And maybe for the first candidate to be a co-supervisor first, but then you need to have a good mentor as the main supervisor. That is extremely helpful for a novice researcher. If you have, and it might be useful from an institutional perspective, to kind of thinking very carefully how we pair novice supervisors as co-supervisors with more established researchers. But the established researchers need to understand their mentoring role in this relationship. If they do, it can be extremely rewarding and building of kind of supervisory self-esteem in the process. So that would be my advice around both the numbers, but also building the relationships and finding, and even if you're the main supervisor, finding a more experienced supervisor that could act as an informal mentor for you.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's really useful advice. The vast majority of UK-based universities will require supervisory teams in any case. So the chances are that is how it would evolve. But I think it's useful also to just recall, and I know Marisi Nerad did some work on this a few years ago, but that sense that actually you're inducting the PhD into a community of practice, into a much wider community. So it's not all on you, it's not all on your shoulders.
Yes.
I think Marisi quotes a Nigerian proverb that says it takes a village to raise a child. And that sense that we're all part of a global village and a global community, of researchers and practitioners, and that PhD candidate becomes part of that community.
And also, I mean, the whole village idea, we've talked about this quite a bit, but it's really useful because it also enables any supervisor, but particularly an early career researcher, to be able to say, I frankly don't know, but I'll find out. If you sort of left to your own devices, you don't have that room to move. So that's quite important, I think, to have that collegiality and that sense of belonging in that relationship.
Sure. That's a great note to end on, so it just remains for me to thank Liezel very, very much for her time and thoughts and the effort that she's put into preparing for this webinar, and to invite you again to come along to, well, either Liezel's next big international conference, which will be in spring 2021, Spear Wine Estate near Stellenbosch, and also to join the IDEN International Doctoral Education Network, which you can Google it and find out how, or to register for the November 29 event on North-South Global Collaborations in Doctoral Education, and that's on the UKCGE website.
Thank you once again for inviting me, and you're welcome to contact me if you want to have more of a conversation around supervision and capacity building.
Thank you.